Well, hi folks, and welcome to the next video in the Cathar series. This is actually video number 2. The first one, you'll remember, was the God, the devil, and the Cathar church. And in that one we covered the beliefs of the Cathars, how the church grew, how it eventually got towards the Languedoc, and how in the Languedoc, from the very few Cathar perfects that arrived in the 12th century, the religious fervour was massive. They started off with just a few perfects talking on the edges of towns, and it ended up that the following of these bon chrétiens, these Cathar perfects, was measurable in their thousands. This growth was, of course, a massive threat to the Orthodox Catholic Church. So the first thing they did was they organised conferences where leaders of the Cathar Church and the Catholic Church would meet together, and they would discuss items of theology, trying to come to some sort of consensus. But this wasn't found. So in the words of Dominic Guzman of the Dominican order, preaching and entreaty have failed you. Now you'll receive the stick. And this stick became known as the Albigensian Crusade. And it's this crusade against these Christians that we're going to cover in this video now. So the Pope called for a crusade. He said, "Forward, soldiers of Christ, forward, volunteers of the army of God. Go forth with the church's cry of anguish ringing in your ears. Fill your souls with godly rage to avenge the insult of our Lord." And this started in the mighty city of Beziers, overlooking the Orbe River. The armies arrived at Beziers on the 22nd of June 1209, and if you stood on the threshold outside the cathedral there above the city walls, you can see out for miles and miles and miles over the plains, and those plains were covered as far as the eye could see with the enemy, with the armies of the French lords, controlled by the Catholic Church and Donald Armory, who was the papal legate. Now the Lord of Carcassonne, and it was Count Raymond Roger Trencavel. He was a young man when he became the Lord. He was only 9, and he was pretty unexperienced in the ways of war, and he was 24 years old when the armies gathered. So as the armies marched south from the north of France, Raymond Roger rode north to Montpellier, where he met Arnold Armory and discussed any sort of treaty they might be able to come to. But he was told point blank that he had to provide 222 Cathars, named Cathars, they had a list of them, from the city of Beziers, and if they did that, then the city would be free. But obviously this meant the 222 people there would be burned alive. So Roger retorted that he would rather be drowned in the salty sea than to change anything in his government. So he quickly jumped back on his horse, went straight back to Beziers, and convinced the town leaders to hold the city, because he was going to go to Carcassonne, which was the biggest and strongest town of the area. He was going to raise an army, and he was going to come back and protect the city. And so off he went. He left that night to Carcassonne, taking, unusually, all the Jewish population of the city with him. So as we've said, on the morning of 22nd of June 1209, this was even before the armies arrived, and it was even before they had a chance to raise a real siege. Fate played its hand. There were some young siege workers just lying on the river or beneath the city walls, and this was a little bit too much for some of the young men of the city. They opened a door in the wall of the city, rushed down, grabbed one of the siege workers, and threw him in the River Orbe. So seeing this, some of the siege workers and some of the army fled at the door, broke through the door before they had a chance to close it, and basically the siege was over before it even began. Now, it was at this time that the famous words were spoken by Arnold Armory: "Kill them all, God will know his own." And the slaughter that took place that day was hard to put into words. The army ransacked the city, slashing, burning, looting and murdering. It was only because of the fires, the heat from the fires from the burning city, that made the army actually leave. They turned the city that day into an abattoir and murdered the entire 20,000 inhabitants. Arnold Armory wrote to the Pope of their success: nearly 20,000 people put to the side, regardless of age, of sex. The workings of divine vengeance have been wonderful. A threshold had been crossed in the ordering of men's minds, and the Cathars had received their first stick. At a meeting to discuss like a debrief of the proceedings of the day, the church leaders resolved that any city that resisted them, the entire population will be put to the sword. The leaders of the city of Narbonne, which is not far from Beziers, I've travelled back from Sword myself many times, hearing this, the city leaders decided to acquiesce, and they provided all the Cathars and the Jewish population to the Catholic Church for disposal. So Narbonne was then exempt from any more proceedings in the Albigensian Crusade. The armies then marched on. They left Beziers and they headed towards Carcassonne, stopping off at the various villages and little towns and hilltop circulated hamlets on the way, most of which had been abandoned. So all they did was just occupy the town, call it theirs, moved on, collected all the food and moved on. So by the time they arrived at Carcassonne, the army was refreshed and well fed, even though Raymond Roger had burned the area around, so there was nothing for the siege workers when they arrived to eat. They broke up the mills, they poisoned the wells, etc. So when they arrived, the powerful King Pedro of Aragon had intervened on the behalf of Raymond Roger, because he was his liege lord. So for this reason, Arnold Armory said that Raymond could leave Carcassonne with 11 of his friends, but then he would be free, but the rest of the city would then belong to the Crusade. But he said he'd rather be flayed alive than to acquiesce to such a base betrayal of his people. So the army arrived on the 1st of August and set up siege around the fantastic city of La Cité, Carcassonne. The siege engines came into play in the morning, and they battered the city, and they were in for the long haul. There were two areas, the north and the south of the city, that were small walled areas with communities in. They went first because the walls were easily scalable. But unfortunately, this meant that the river was cut off to the main La Cité itself. So the water shortages began. They only had to rely on the two wells in La Cité, and eventually they dried up. And then a lone horseman arrived at the city wall, probably Raymond of Toulouse, because Raymond had just transferred his allegiance to the Crusade, because he was a Catholic and he wanted to be on the side of the Pope. Now his message to Raymond, his kinsman, started pleasant enough. He said, I hope you are going to favour well, and if you believe that reinforcements are going to come soon, I very much advise you to hold out, but you must know now that this is never going to happen. So, because of this, Raymond took his other Raymond, Raymond Roger, to the pavilions of the French under a sacred parley known as piratage to discuss the situation, maybe come to an agreement, again with Arnold Armory. But because it was him in charge, Raymond Roger was taken prisoner against all piratage and all noble intent, basically in treachery. So this ended the siege of the city. The people of the Carcassonne were then strangely told to leave the city in single file through one gate. And so what they were looking for, we don't know, but they watched them file out of the city one at a time. The residents of the city of Carcassonne disappeared into the hills, along the river, and into history. And so the Carcassonne then was owned by the Crusaders and by the Catholic Church. The huge Chateau Camptal, which is is on the walls inside La Cité Carcassonne, which we visit still now on our tours. This was the home of the Trencavel family, Raymond Roger Trencavel. So this was now empty. It was offered to many lords, Count of Burgundy and many others, but they turned down the opportunity of owning Carcassonne and moving into the castle because he said that this was won in treachery, not in honour. And then an aged, well, it was 40-odd, count called Simon de Montfort, who was a minor count in the Ile-de-France in Paris without any lands. He took on the ownership of the Count of Carcassonne and the surrounding districts. He basically took over from Raymond Roger. He moved into the chateau with an army of hundreds. Raymond Roger then died in prison on the 10th of November, supposedly of dysentery, but as many people say that Simon de Montfort had a bigger hand in this. Anyway, so now Simon de Montfort is in Carcassonne as the Lord. The rest of the armies of the French, thinking, okay, this is basically the end of the Crusade, and it was harvest time as well, so they headed off north, leaving de Montfort in charge. And he basically started a process of major subduing of his population through the sword and through taxes. There are various stories of how de Montfort acted as he moved through the Languedoc. At the wonderful city of Minerve, he set a huge the biggest siege engine ever seen. It was called La Voisin, the bad neighbour, and it pounded the citadel and broke the town. And a beautiful town that if ever you're in there, it's really, really worth seeing. It's a one-off. And it was a place where 200 years earlier, Pliny the Elder admired the wines from the grapes grown on the vineyards which surrounded the citadel walls. In Levert, they threw the Dame of the Well, the Dame of the City down the well while she was still alive. She threw stones on top of him until she stopped screaming and then burned 400 Cathars alive. They moved to the more or less impenetrable Chateau Latour, which is like 3 or 4 chateaux on hills with valleys in between. Very difficult to attack, because you couldn't find anywhere to put your siege engines to effectively bombard the city. So de Montfort decided to send a message. And this message involved taking 100 people from the town of Bran, where he set about a process of disfigurement. He removed their top lips and their noses and their ears. He then gouged out all their eyes apart from one prisoner who was allowed to keep one eye because he was going to be the leader. And they set off as a procession back to Latour to deliver the message, a grimacing spectacle of walking skulls, grisly. And then eventually the inevitable happened, and the city of Toulouse became the focus for de Montfort's attack, where previously Raymond had been on the side of the Crusade, which just goes to show. Anyway, they arrived, de Montfort's armies arrived and laid siege around the city in October 1217. Raymond of Toulouse had ordered a massive defence of the city, saying that the church had no right to relieve him, deprive him of his birthright. And in a joint effort to match any in the history of mankind, the city of Toulouse was made ready for attack. And it was the 8th of October 1217 where de Montfort started the bombardment of the city. The Pope's representatives were heard to shout, "Let no man or woman escape alive." And de Montfort's army fell against the defences of the city. This continued for some time, until eventually there was a group of defenders in the city that ran out and destroyed a huge a siege engine, and then they ran back into the city, followed by de Montfort's troops, with de Montfort leading it. Now this left them in total exposure to the arrows and the siege engines from the walls, and it was at this point that Simon de Montfort was hit full on the head with the payload of a mangonel operated by the women of the city. And this was time for massive celebrations. It was the 25th of June 1218. Le loup est mort. The wolf was dead. Residents of the Languedoc can still quote the final words of the Canso de Crusade, the Song of the Cathar Wars, and this is it. "And I have heard it said that this must be so, if by killing men and spilling blood, by wasting souls and preaching murder, by following evil counsels and raising fires, by ruining noblemen and besmirching piratage, by pillaging the country and by extolling pride, by stoking up wickedness and stifling good, by massacring women in the world, then Simon surely wears a crown resplendent in heaven." So at this point, the siege was lifted, and Cathar perfects could be seen again in the streets of the Languedoc. For all intents and purposes, the Albigensian Crusade was over. But this is not the end of the story, because in the next video we'll talk about the arrival of the Inquisition and the story of the mountaintop citadel of Montségur. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please do click on like and on subscribe and on the little bell to be informed of future videos. And I'll see you in the next one.